just 5 minutes, a powerful judge tried to silence Jasmine Crockett with a $15,000 fine. No evidence, no hearing, just power abused. But what he didn't expect was that this very moment would push him to the brink of his own downfall. What was supposed to be a routine procedural hearing exploded into a breathless battle between arrogance and justice. Can a woman armed only with law and courage bring an entire system to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was a cold, gray morning in downtown Chicago. Courtroom 2A was scheduled for a minor procedural hearing, just a quick check on paperwork. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Jasmine, a seasoned lawyer and former prosecutor, had seen enough to sense when a room was rigged. The silence was too deep. The court staff avoided eye contact. Even the walls felt like they were listening. Judge Richard Monroe was already seated, tall, stern, and known for pushing verdicts through without hearing full arguments. He didn't read files. He delivered sentences. His cold stare followed Jasmine as she walked in. He didn't look at her like a lawyer. He looked at her like an obstacle. The courtroom felt like a trap, and Jasmine was walking straight into it. Everyone could feel it. The air wasn't just tense. It was controlled. The judge wasn't there for justice. He was there for power. Judge Monroe entered with a presence that sucked the air out of the room. He didn't pause. He didn't greet the court. He didn't glance at the counsel tables. He simply sat, adjusted his robe with one sharp tug, and then looked straight ahead, eyes cold and flat. His voice came next, low, clipped, and without hesitation. This matter is already clear. The defendant is in violation of Code 22F. The fine is $15,000 to be paid immediately. That is the court's decision. No build-up, no explanation, no process. Just a blunt declaration, as if the case had already been tried and buried long before the doors even opened. Jasmine hadn't spoken a word. Her files were still closed. Her hands, resting calmly on the table just moments earlier, now curled slightly, controlled, but tense. Across the room, even the prosecutor looked up in confusion, brows furrowed, shifting in his seat like he'd missed something crucial. He hadn't. Everyone had, because there hadn't been anything to miss. No arguments, no evidence. Not even the usual procedural opening, just a ruling, final, cold, irrevocable. It was a legal firing squad, and Jasmine was expected to nod, accept it, and walk away wounded. She didn't, but first she tried to understand. "Your Honor," she said carefully, rising just halfway from her seat. "With all respect, we haven't even begun. I haven't presented a single argument." Monroe's eyes narrowed, not with reconsideration but with irritation. "Because none are needed," he snapped. "You violated the code. It's not up for debate." His tone wasn't simply dismissive. It was biting, deliberate, meant to humiliate. This wasn't a misunderstanding of the law. It was a calculated message. "Sit down. Be quiet. Don't challenge this court." Jasmine didn't react the way most people would at that moment. No raised voice, no visible frustration. She remained standing, her hands calmly folded in front of her, every movement precise, controlled. Her heart might have been pounding beneath her tailored blazer, but on the outside, she was unshakable. That control wasn't just instinct. It was training. Years as a prosecutor had taught her that in a courtroom where power is misused, restraint is the sharpest weapon. She took a breath, then spoke with clarity and purpose. "Your Honor, with full respect, I am formally requesting the opportunity to present my defense. Due process requires that I be heard." Her voice cut through the silence, not loud, but unmistakably firm. Her words carried not just legal authority, but moral weight. She wasn't asking. She was invoking a right. But Monroe didn't flinch. He didn't even pretend to consider her request. He looked straight at her now, but not with fairness. His eyes narrowed, jaw locked, as if her mere words had offended him. He leaned forward, both elbows on the bench, and said louder this time, "Miss Crockett, this is not your stage. This is my courtroom, and I will not entertain speeches or stall tactics." The words cracked like a whip across the room. "The violation is on record. The fine is final. You want to argue? Take it to appeals, if it gets that far." His tone was sharp, final, and laced with contempt. Not legal skepticism. Personal contempt, the kind that turns rulings into punishments, and punishments into warnings for everyone watching. The courtroom had become a theater of intimidation, and Jasmine was the target. She didn't move. She stood like a statue under pressure. But inside her mind, everything accelerated, fast, focused. This wasn't legal procedure. It was an execution of control. Monroe wasn't upholding the law. He was using the bench as a throne. His voice, his posture, his refusal to even let her speak. It all pointed to one truth. He had already made up his mind, and nothing she said would change it. But it wasn't just about her case. It was about silencing her in front of everyone. To make an example. To remind every attorney, every clerk, every citizen watching from the gallery. You challenge me, and I will crush you openly, without hesitation. Jasmine could feel it. This wasn't about the code violation anymore. It was about her presence, her confidence, her unwillingness to play submissive. Monroe wasn't reacting to the law. He was reacting to her power, her voice, and now he was trying to strip it from her, one ruling at a time. The prosecutor avoided eye contact. The court reporter had paused her fingers. The room wasn't neutral anymore. It had turned hostile. And yet, in that silence, Jasmine found clarity. Monroe had made one thing absolutely clear. He never planned to give her a fair hearing. He didn't come to listen. He came to dominate. Still, she didn't sit. She didn't fold. Her voice was lower now, but stronger. "Then I suppose," she said, eyes locked on him, "we proceed on the record. Every word, every step. Because if the law wouldn't protect her today, the truth would. And every injustice needs a witness." And that was when Jasmine made her move, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous to a man like Judge Monroe. Clarity. She had watched enough by then to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't haste. This was surgical suppression. She wasn't being fined for a code violation. She was being silenced for who she was, for the strength in her voice, and the refusal in her posture. Everything in Monroe's courtroom had been arranged to deliver a message. You don't belong here. You may know the law, but I own the bench. He had the gavel. But Jasmine had something heavier. Precedent, and as she reached into her folder, the shift in the room was almost audible. The quiet wasn't respected anymore. It was anticipation, the kind of stillness before the first domino falls. She laid out the documents on the desk in front of her, like pieces to a machine only she knew how to operate. Each page had been chosen, marked and rehearsed for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, sharp. "We're about to talk about precedent because what you're doing has already been judged." And it didn't hold up. She raised the first page. Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017. The defendant was fined under a local enforcement code. No photos, no inspection reports, no affidavit, just the officer's claim. That case went to appeal. The court found the process unconstitutional and reversed the fine in full. She let it sit for a moment, then continued. In its written opinion, the appellate court stated, quote, "Where there is no evidence, there is no enforcement. The integrity of due process demands more than assumption." Her tone never changed. She wasn't trying to perform. She was building pressure, Line by line, statute by statute, she flipped the second page. Henderson vs. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. An officer issued a fine based on a visual assessment. No photos, no timestamps, no physical record. City argued it was standard practice. The court disagreed. In its ruling, it stated, administrative authority does not exist in a vacuum. Fines must be based on verifiable fact, or they are void under constitutional review. She looked up slowly, locking eyes with Monroe. That ruling was upheld at every level, and that was the first time Monroe shifted. It was small, a tightening of the jaw, a slight adjustment of his shoulders, but Jasmine caught it. So did the others. The clerk's typing resumed, almost with urgency now. The prosecutor uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, hands clasped, suddenly, more spectator than participant. Jasmine leaned in too, not physically but rhetorically. "You fined me $15,000, she said, without requesting evidence, without allowing argument, without even opening the hearing. Her voice hardened, not louder, just sharper. There is no documentation, no testimony, just your word. And respectfully, Your Honor, that is not justice. That is authoritarianism in judicial robes." A subtle wave of discomfort moved through the gallery. Attorneys in the back exchanged quick glances, as if silently asking each other, is she really saying this? She was, and she wasn't finished. Jasmine tapped her file one more time. "I bring these cases not as theory, but as binding reminders of what this courtroom is supposed to represent. When a judge ignores process, silences defense, and rules without proof, they are not interpreting the law. They are violating it. And I won't let that happen quietly." She stood still, eyes locked on Monroe, her voice lowered to almost a whisper, but it carried like thunder. "You can ignore my argument, but you can't erase precedent, and you will not rewrite the Constitution from behind that bench." Judge Monroe didn't blink at first, but Jasmine noticed the shift. His jaw tightened, his eyes lost their sharp focus for half a second, darting toward the clerk, then toward the prosecution table. His fingers, once calmly resting on the bench, began to tap a slow, uneven rhythm. He was calculating hard. Every move he'd made up to this point had been built on control, on intimidation, on the assumption that Jasmine would either back down or crack under pressure. But now the foundation he stood on had started to fracture. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself, she had done it with surgical precision, citing appellate rulings and constitutional language he could not dismiss, without making a mockery of the very legal system he claimed to uphold. And that terrified him more than anger ever could. His voice, when it finally came, had lost its earlier bite. "This court will recess for 15 minutes. It was an escape disguised as procedure, a retreat hidden behind decorum." The bailiff moved quickly, opening the door to chambers as Monroe disappeared. Behind it, his robe trailing like a shield he was no longer confident in carrying. But Jasmine knew exactly what had just happened. That wasn't a break to consider evidence. That was a tactical withdrawal, a pause to strategize, to call someone, to dig for anything he could use to discredit her, derail her, or delay the inevitable. Because now he wasn't just facing a lawyer, he was facing accountability. The courtroom for a moment remained still, as if unsure whether it had permission to breathe again. The clerk looked visibly unsettled, eyes flickering toward Jasmine, but never fully meeting her gaze. The prosecutor sat stone-faced, but his fingers fidgeted nervously in his lap. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't move. She remained standing, her back straight, her hands still resting gently on the stack of precedents she had just unloaded like live ammunition. She wasn't looking for applause. She was reading the room. And what she saw was exactly what Monroe feared. Doubt. Doubt creeping into the cracks of his authority. Doubt rippled across every silent observer who had just witnessed what few ever dared to say aloud in a courtroom, that even a judge could be wrong, even a judge could be cornered. 15 minutes, that was all he'd asked for. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't 15 minutes of reflection, it took him 15 minutes to save himself. He would try to rewrite his strategy, shift the narrative, maybe even bring in reinforcements. Because the only thing more dangerous than a well-prepared attorney is one who is fearless, grounded in truth, and unwilling to yield under pressure. Jasmine had just stepped across a line that most never dared approach. She didn't just demand fairness. She forced the court to confront its own imbalance, and Monroe, for all his years on the bench, had no playbook for that. As the clock ticked on and the room settled into a fragile, uncertain quiet, Jasmine remained still, ready, focused, and unshaken. The judge had left to search for higher ground, but she wasn't going anywhere. Not until every inch of that courtroom remembered what it meant to stand for justice. When the door to the judge's chambers finally opened, all eyes turned and then narrowed with confusion. Judge Monroe re-entered, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a second figure, taller, older, with a gait that radiated institutional gravity. Judge Thomas Whitaker. His black robe seemed heavier than Monroe's, the fabric moving with the kind of deliberate weight only earned through decades of federal bench power. The room shifted instantly. It wasn't just about another body in the courtroom. It was about what his presence implied. A low murmur swept through the gallery, not of curiosity but of unease. Even the court officer stood taller, straighter, as if suddenly realizing this case had graduated from routine to something far more combustible. Jasmine didn't need anyone to tell her what this meant. You don't summon Judge Whitaker into a hearing like this unless something is spiraling. And Monroe, for all his arrogance, had finally felt the rope tightening. Monroe returned to the bench, his voice stripped of the dominance it carried earlier. "For the record," he said, clearing his throat, "I have invited Judge Whitaker to observe, and if necessary, provide guidance on certain procedural questions that have arisen." It was a carefully crafted statement, one meant to sound procedural, impartial, routine. But everyone in that room could hear the truth buried underneath. He was losing control, and now he needed someone with more authority to anchor the ship before it capsized. Monroe didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't, not after the precision with which she dismantled his earlier ruling. Instead, he leaned back, almost disappearing into his chair, letting Whitaker's presence fill the space he could no longer command. Jasmine stood calmly, but her senses were on high alert. She had read about Whitaker, a former appellate judge turned senior federal overseer, known for his intellect, his ruthlessness in cross-review, and his iron sense of courtroom order. He wasn't the type to shout, he didn't need to. One look from him was often more effective than 100 objections, and now that gaze landed on Jasmine, not with hostility, but with razor-sharp scrutiny. He was assessing her, not just her words, but her posture, her breath, the cadence of her silence. And Jasmine knew what this meant. She was no longer just defending herself from a biased ruling. She was standing trial in front of the system itself. She didn't waver. She met his gaze 1 second longer than necessary, her chin lifted, her presence anchored. She wasn't intimidated, but she was aware. This wasn't just a courtroom now, it was a battlefield of legacy versus reform, of entitlement versus earned credibility. Monroe had brought in Whitaker, hoping to tip the scales, to outrank her voice with hierarchy. But Jasmine had something neither robe could override: precedent, constitutional grounding, and an undeniable record of being right. This wasn't just a legal defense anymore. It was a challenge to the hierarchy that had allowed Monroe to operate unchecked for years. Whitaker adjusted his robe, glanced down at the case file, and finally spoke. His voice was even, deliberate, but unmistakably commanding. "Ms. Crockett," he said, "you've raised several constitutional concerns regarding the enforcement of Code 22F. I would like you to restate your core argument for the record. It wasn't a request, it was a test, a live audit. And Jasmine understood. She had walked into a rigged courtroom, dismantled the trap, and now had to defend her truth under federal spotlight. One misstep, and everything could collapse. But one precise word, and she would not only survive this room, she'd own it. And so, without looking down, without hesitation, she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I'll begin with the due process failures supported by appellate precedent." Her voice didn't just respond, it declared. The rules had changed, the power had shifted, and Monroe knew it. Whitaker was here to weigh the law, but the courtroom was already leaning toward Jasmine. The courtroom had settled into a cold, humming quiet. Jasmine stood at the defense table, her hand lightly resting on the leather edge of her folder. She didn't move as the bailiff called Officer Nathan Ellis to the stand. From the back of the room, a man rose with a stiff posture of someone who believed he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His navy blue uniform was spotless, his badge gleaming like it had just been polished for this moment. He walked with the kind of confidence that comes from 2 decades of never being challenged. That was about to change. Jasmine watched him with surgical stillness. Ellis didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead, like a man checking off a form he'd filled out 100 times. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, and repeated the oath. Then he sat down, folded his hands, and waited, like he already knew how this would end. Jasmine took 3 slow steps toward the witness box. Not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to let him and everyone watching feel the weight of what was coming. "Officer Ellis," she began, her tone calm, not confrontational. "You issued the citation that resulted in the fine against me, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied easily, almost too casually. "And that citation was based on a violation you claim to have observed?" "That's right." She nodded slightly. "Let's break that down. Did you document the alleged violation with any photographs?" "No, ma'am," he said, shaking his head. "Didn't need to." Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. "Did you write a detailed incident report?" "No. No diagram, no witness affidavit, no time-stamped image from a city camera." "None required," Ellis replied with a small shrug. "Was there anyone else present at the time of the alleged violation?" "Number 1 was alone." Jasmine paused for 1 full second. Then she turned slightly toward the gallery and the bench. Her words were slow, deliberate. "So to be clear, you issued a fine for $15,000 based entirely on your personal judgment, with no photographic evidence, no written report, no third-party verification, and no supporting documentation?" "Yes," he said again, this time with a touch of irritation. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know what a violation looks like." There it was, the moment of arrogance, the assumption that experience equals immunity. Jasmine's lips curled into a faint smile, controlled, calculated. "I'm sure you do, officer," she said, her tone velvet with just the slightest edge of steel. "But we're not here to debate your instincts. We're here to talk about evidence." Ellis shifted. It wasn't a large movement, but it was enough. The confidence so firm a minute ago now had a crack. She took a small step closer. "Do you believe that your personal opinion, without supporting evidence, is enough to override the due process rights of a citizen in a federal court?" His brow furrowed. "I believe my experience gives me the ability to make sound judgments in the field." "Judgments, yes," Jasmine said, her voice cooling. "But fines, penalties, legal consequences that carry weight under the Constitution." She turned back to the bench. "Your Honors, what we have here is not enforcement. It's an assumption, not a process. It's a projection." Officer Ellis didn't observe a crime. He interpreted one and then treated that interpretation as law. She returned her eyes to Ellis. "Can you point to anything in the citation file, Anything that constitutes physical, verifiable evidence? No, ma'am, he said, quieter now. Jasmine didn't gloat. She let the silence speak instead, a long pause. Every eye was on her. She turned toward the bench again, her tone sharpening. Your Honor, Whitaker, Your Honor, Monroe, this officer just admitted, under oath, that his entire case is based on subjective judgment, not probable cause, not statutory measurement, just a feeling. She tapped the side of her folder, and yet a $15,000 fine was levied. Not on proof, not on documentation, but on what one man thought he saw. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. He didn't say anything, but his silence no longer felt neutral. Jasmine stepped forward again, lowering her voice. This isn't about Officer Ellis. It's about the standard we accept in a court of law. If this is allowed to stand, if a fine can be imposed without a shred of real evidence, then every citizen is just one bad mood away from a financial death sentence. Because what Ellis is calling enforcement, the Constitution calls arbitrary, and the courts call it unconstitutional. She turned back toward the gallery, scanning the faces. Some looked stunned, others disturbed. A few, like the younger attorneys in the back row, looked newly awakened, as if they were watching the very definition of power imbalance being dismantled in real time. She returned her focus to the officer. Final question, Officer Ellis, if someone were to challenge your citation like we are now, what evidence would you offer this court to support your decision? Ellis looked at the judges, then at Jasmine. He hesitated. His throat moved as he swallowed. I would say that I acted within the scope of my training and experience. Noted, Jasmine replied, voice sharp as glass. So we are left with this, a $15,000 punishment based solely on one man's memory, with zero physical evidence and no oversight. Then she said it, the line that cracked the room open. So what you're calling a citation officer is really just your opinion in uniform, a fine dressed up in personal belief. The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was electric, thick. Every person in that courtroom realized the weight of what had just been said. The state's case wasn't just weak, it was hollow. The emperor had no clothes, and Jasmine had just called it out with a surgeon's grace. Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. Monroe looked down at his bench, lips pressed thin. The prosecutor didn't speak. He couldn't, because anything said in defense of Ellis now would only confirm how far this had gone off the rails. Jasmine took a single step back, not in retreat, but in finality. Her message had landed. The system that tried to steamroll her now sat in stunned silence, facing the simple truth she had dragged into the light. You cannot punish without proof. Not in this courtroom, not today, not anymore. Jasmine turned back, toward the bench, her hand resting gently on the folder that now lay open like a loaded weapon. Her voice lowered, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted every person in the room to lean in and listen. Your Honors, she said, looking first at Whitaker, then Monroe. You've heard the legal precedent, you've heard the procedural failure. But let's not pretend this is about paper anymore. This is about people, real people who never got the chance to stand in this courtroom, people who were crushed by the weight of invisible authority, just like I nearly was today. She slowly flipped a page inside the folder, then held it in the air. Let me introduce you to Daniel Reese, Vietnam veteran, who lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He came home from war with shrapnel in his leg and a dream in his gut to open his own repair garage. He spent 2 decades building it, saved every dime, rebuilt. Transmissions by hand, helped other vets for free when they were down on their luck. And then one day, out of nowhere, the city emailed him saying his business license was suspended. Not revoked for misconduct, not flagged for safety violations, suspended because of an administrative oversight. His online renewal was missing one checkbox, just one. No phone call, no warning, just a line of red text in a government database. She let the silence sit for a moment. The judge's pen hovered above the paper but didn't move. The gallery was absolutely still. He tried to appeal, but no one would hear him. They said the system had auto-flagged his file. And while he was trying to fight that invisible machine, customers left, rent piled up. Within 3 months, Daniel was out of business. He lost his shop, then his house. The city finally admitted the mistake 6 months later. You know what they gave him? Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. A letter of apology, typed, no signature. She turned the page. Karen Bautista, Savannah, Georgia, master electrician. Years, no accidents, no violations. She trained apprentices, ran her own crew. Then 1 year, the city quietly changed the licensing codes. Suddenly, her state license was labeled non-transferable under revised municipal standards. No one could explain what that meant. Not the board, not the clerk. But they told her she couldn't pull permits anymore. Couldn't inspect. Couldn't work. She was told to start over. Like her career had never existed, she fought it. She asked for clarity. She even filed a public records request. And they denied it, saying the transition policy was internal. Jasmine inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, controlling not just her breath, but the entire rhythm of the courtroom. He looked straight at Monroe, and her voice sharpened like a scalpel. And what did they call that decision, Your Honor? Standardization. That's the word they used. Cold, bureaucratic standardization. She paused again. She eventually moved to Florida to start again. She lost her crew, her contracts, her home, her name, and no one was ever held accountable. Now comes the final story. She placed the last page on top of the stack, then looked out at the gallery before speaking. James Weller, 62, retired long-haul trucker, lived outside Waco, Texas, used his pension to buy a small piece of land, built a cedar fence with his own 2 hands. It was 17 inches.